Okay, great. Cool. Nick Savas, welcome back.
This is Roadmap to Retirement. Tune in for financial tips, investment strategies, and smart money moves to supercharge your retirement savings. Alex Neri, CFP, and guests are here to help you build your roadmap to retirement.
A friend of the show, back again. Happy to be here. I think this is the third time I've
Their
been on this
appearance.
podcast.
There you go. So all our
Excited.
listeners are going to go back and listen to the first two for all of your
hope-
wisdom.
I hope they do.
They're going to be very excited about that.
Yeah.
Cool. So we don't have one topic today. We've got 15 topics today, which is going to be awesome. So we're going to talk really fast. We're going to go through 15 topics in 20 minutes.
Great. Rapid fire.
Rapid fire. Not really. So a couple topics. So we try to pull these conversations from conversations that we both have with clients, questions that we get commonly, and try to build that around what we think people would talk about, learn about. So inflation is not a new topic, but I got a question. I was hosting a seminar and we were running through kind of a sample plan. And the person who attended the seminar asked, how do you pick an inflation rate? Do you use historical rates of inflation? Are you running at a higher rate today because we seem to be in a higher inflation environment? Which is a good question. I typically use a historical rate when I'm running it. I think that if a client is more concerned about inflation or we've had an in-depth conversation about inflation, we'll show them a few different models where we'll say this is at 3%, this is at 5%.
Yep.
So that's my answer to the guy. And then I started thinking about more, what is the right way to do that? So I'll ask you that in a second. But before I do that, I'm going to toss you a couple softball questions. I know that you know these. You're a CFP. You have to know this. What would you say is the rate of inflation historically going back to the year 1914?
What's the average long term?
Yep. Average inflation over the last, whatever that is,
3.2%.
That's pretty good. 3.29%.
Ooh, all right.
You idiot. You got to know that. And then same question going back into 2006. I think this is an old study, so it might not be up to date. So since 2006, I'll just tell you the rate of inflation is 2.5%. So we have a lower inflationary environment for a long time. And then going out of COVID, we've of course seen this extra inflation. So that's why it's on everyone's mind. All that being said, tell me your approach when you're doing a financial plan. How do you address inflation?
So I would say, generally speaking, I follow a similar approach to the way that you did, where we use right abound a 3% inflation rate to just baseline look at, okay, you need $8,000 a month starting in 15 years when you're 65. We're going to adjust that, right? So that's the baseline. I like your approach because it allows us to stress test it so we can say, okay, and then people feel this now, obviously, which is we're living through a higher inflationary time. So it's a lot easier to envision how this is going to impact people. Whereas 10 years ago when inflation was 2% or so, and it's harder to envision how much this cost is going to increase by the time I retire. So that's definitely changed the conversation, but we will stress test it against higher rates, similar to the way you do, to see if we can still make it work. The other thing I will say is the headline inflation rate is a specific formula. I think they have a bunch of categories that they use, and I believe they exclude food and energy prices out of the core that everyone sees. So my point is the inflation rate that the headline number could be very different than your own personal inflation rate. So, which is going to be different for everybody. So someone's own personal inflation rate might be actually much lower than what the headlines say because of what they choose to spend money on or where their needs are and wants are. So for some people, it might be higher. So I think it goes back to just going into the cash flow discussion a little bit to see, hey, what are you actually spending money on? Are we going to continue to spend money on this moving forward in retirement? And then the other piece of it too, just outside of lifestyle expenses is healthcare expenses, which statistically speaking rise at a much higher rate than the core inflation, closer to 5, not even 6%, which arguably is one of the biggest expenses that people have throughout their entire retirement. So it's a balancing act, but that's what makes it more personalized.
So I guess the simple advice is just don't go to the hospital when you're in the clear, right?
Yeah, simple advice. Don't go to the hospital. Go back 30 years and have an HSA maxed out for 30 years. Yeah, right.
Quit smoking.
Yeah.
I like the way that you framed it, though, the personal rate of inflation. Yeah, because I think a lot of people don't see it that way. And I won't pretend I memorized any of these stats or anything, but I Googled inflation for retirees and found an article. So I broke it down into 4 categories of the highest inflation, or 4 categories that are experiencing the highest inflation. So car insurance was one, which is interesting. I guess it goes back to the cost of repairing a broken car.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. Housing, which I'll talk about in a second here, gas and energy, and then groceries. So groceries, everyone's going to complain about forever. Every time you go to the grocery store, you're going to
Yep.
feel that.
Yep.
Housing is interesting for retirees because I won't say that most, but a lot of retirees going into retirement, they paid off their mortgage and they're no longer experiencing that expense. So if the cost of houses in their neighborhood goes up by 30%, sticker shock, but it doesn't really matter if they're in their house and not planning on moving.
Yep.
I'll talk about what they're planning on moving in a minute here. But I think maybe that's the good news for retirees is if you adjust everything to your personal rate of inflation, you can say, yes, even though inflation's really high in housing and that sucks for my kids and grandkids, for me, the 60-something-year-old, 70-something-year-old that's already retired and already paid off my house, I'm just not experiencing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, with housing inflation and the rates going up, that could lead to higher assessments, which lead to higher property taxes, which no one likes.
Yeah. I know you did too, right?
Yes, we do live in the same town, so I got that assessment.
You got that letter? I also got that letter. It's funny.
But yeah, but there's even with that, there's for retirees and seniors, there's star credits and enhanced. So there's things that can be done to offset some of those additional costs that are in place that we want to make sure we're taking advantage of. But again, just I think treating it as a personalized expense, your personal inflation rate, I think is the best way to go about it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It all goes back to having a plan, understanding where your money's going, understanding how your budget should change along with those inflation rates.
Yeah.
As long as you can really get in the weeds on it, you can break down your budget into a huge spreadsheet and look at every thing you spend money on. That's probably more than you want to do. I think using a historical rate of inflation is good for planning. It's tough to swallow though. Like when I sit in my office and walk somebody through their plan and I say we're using the assumption of even 3.5%, which is historically high, they're not always hearing that well because they just saw on TV last night inflation was 9%. So it's like, what do you mean you're using, a third of the actual rate? But we're going in the assumption that it's not going to be 9% forever. Actually, it's not right now, but it was a couple years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in those situations, and again, it's hard sometimes to zoom out, right? Because our core CPI number is right around 3%, 3.5% right now. 3 years ago, it was 9% year over year. And then 4 years before that, we were in the twos and whatnot. So if we look at it, you zoom out, you look at it like a 20, 30, 40, 50-year block, that's where we're getting some of these numbers.
Right? I guess it's similar to the stock market conversation. If it's April and the market's down 10%, everyone's, oh my God, the market, it's terrible this year. But if you zoom out to like, even give me 12 months, like all of a sudden we're maybe up or whatever it is.
Yep.
So along with the inflation conversation, I think it's natural when you're talking about inflation for retirees to talk about Social Security and the COLA increase on that. So you get this cost of living adjustment each year on Social Security. And historically, most retirees will complain that it lags the real number. It's not really keeping up with it. It's meant to be a percentage of it. Again, I don't memorize stats like this, but I did Google it ahead of this conversation. The COLA increase over the last decade lags the real inflation number by 13.7%. It's not my number. I assume it's right.
Yep.
So that means that if you've been retired for 10 years, the cost of living Social Security has not kept up with it, right? So if you're somebody that's purely living on Social Security, you've lost 13.7% of your buying power. Hopefully, I know the people that we work with typically have some sort of
Something else.
some kind of income besides Social Security, but that's hard for people that are living on the bare minimum. That's hard for people that have built their budget around it.
Yep.
I don't really have a question attached to that, but what is your initial reaction to 13.7%?
To me, it reinforces the fact, again, if people are in retirement and that's their situation, it unfortunately limits the options, because if that's their only source of income and you're already there, you really only have two options. We either have to reduce spending or we got to work to supplement it, right? So I think even if ideally we're meeting people before that, we can help them get to the point where we have to rely less and less on your Social Security, just as a percentage of again, going back, we want to replace $8,000 a month. Social Security might replace $2,500 or $3,000 of that. It was never designed to replace the whole thing, right? So I think just keeping that in mind, and just to me, it's even more of a reason of why we need to have a plan and we need to have a save, really.
Sure. And I think it's about having a good inflation hedge. So if you have Social Security, a lot of people, you have a pension. A lot of people that have pensions, you're really not getting any significant cost of living adjustment either.
We work with people with state pensions, and there's a virtually zero cost of living increase on that. So that's going to really stay static. If you have a private pension, which are harder and harder to come by these days, some of them have that, but again, it's pretty rare. Pensions and Social Security I would just, for the most part, assume they're going to remain relatively fixed. And really the investments are what's going to allow us to keep up with those cost of living increases on the expense side. That's the way I talk to clients about it too.
Yeah. I think I'm seeing more and more people, their strategy going to retirement is really, I've got my pension and Social Security. I'm not going to touch my investments. That's for when Social Security starts to outrun me and I need the asset to live on. It's combinations of both, and everyone's different, like you said. That might be a good segue into a conversation about pensions. Leave the inflation conversation where it is. With the pensions, I've run into a couple situations recently, and I like to start these conversations with stories about clients or conversations I've had. The first one comes to mind. It was a client whose father passed away, left the mother still living without a pension. So the pension option he had chosen way back in the day, 30 something years ago, was the single life option, which means that it was going to pay out for his entire life. When he was no longer here, the pension would stop, which for him at the time, and I don't know him, I didn't know him 30 years ago, certainly, it was about getting the largest monthly check he could possibly get, which was the single life option. Now I'm talking to my client who's explaining her mother's situation, saying that pension's gone away. Yeah, she still gets a Social Security check, but it's not enough for her to live on. And mother, who's well into her 80s, scrambling to figure out what to do here. So that led to another conversation with another person who was recently retired. They'd already selected their pension option. And then going through the financial planning process, we discovered that they would be leaving their spouse in a similar situation if they were to predecease them. So I guess the question is not so much around what option to choose on your pension, but it's more when you see somebody that's already chosen their pension option, they can't go back and change it. What is the Band-Aid we can put on the situation? An obvious one is life insurance, which is where we went with this younger couple. But sometimes that's not an option. If you have a health situation going on, you're not going to qualify for life insurance. Sometimes they're at an age where realistically it's just not on the table.
Too expensive, and it doesn't.
Tough situation. There's not really a good answer, but have you run into similar things? And if so, how do you frame that?
We have, and it's the way I frame it is what gap would this create, right? Because once we look at the entire situation, if I had a couple recently in a situation where the wife is about 10, 12 years younger than the husband. The husband's been retired for a little bit. They have some assets saved, ideally. So we're talking about how to claim her pension option. And I think we're going to go down the road of taking actually the single life on purpose because it's a risk calculation. So if the risk with taking the single life option, it really is if something happens more so in the first half to a third of retirement, obviously that income stops. So in this situation, if that happened, there's enough assets there that the husband would be okay. And he's 10, 12 years older, where his life expectancy is and what he has with his own Social Security, they would be okay if something happened. So we're looking at a situation, how do we just increase and grow the income in retirement as much as possible? If the situation were reversed, age-wise, if the older retiree was the one who had the pension, and then the younger spouse, again, that's a whole different conversation to think about too, because adding the beneficiary on probably is a good decision, but it also probably comes at a pretty big reduction for the older spouse because
That'll be a big change.
So there's so many factors out there. There's age, life expectancy, difference in age, or not only where they are, but between where the spouses are, what other assets are in the household relative to their needs. So to me, it's looking at, is there a gap, right? In a perfect world, hey, if something happened, we have enough assets, there's no problem. If there is a gap, how do we fill it? Is what pension option is going to give us the best chance to do that? Or is something like an insurance policy the better way to actually go about it, which in many cases it is, because it's a lot more cost effective in certain cases. In some cases it's not. It's just you got to look at everything.
So I'm going to play out a scenario for you. So let's say we've got a couple, they're both roughly the same age. We'll say they're 60-ish. He has a pension. She does not. He's already selected the single life option. They're realizing now that maybe that wasn't the best choice or whatever. You can't go back in time. So we're looking at some kind of life insurance policy to supplement that. Now, the insurance guy down the street will tell you that you need $1 million whole life policy and the premium amount is going to be $3,000 a month, but you need to have it. So here it is, sign sign this. That's realistically for most people, we're just not going to do that, right? We're not going to spend $3,000 a month on a life insurance policy. I'm embellishing the numbers a little bit, but realistically, we could go down a road where we can make an argument for a super expensive insurance policy. Not realistic for most people. So alternatively, what I suggested, and I want to know how you feel about this, is let's concern ourselves with the first 15 years of retirement. You're 60 years old now. It sounds like this is similar to what you did, but let's get a 15-year term, which is much more affordable. That gets us from 60 to age 75, which to me, the biggest catastrophe from a retirement planning standpoint is he dies at 62 years old, leaves her high and dry with no insurance, no death benefit on the pension.
Yep.
And now she's going back to work. Whereas if we can get through that first 15 years, that allows us to really just let 15 years play out. Maybe their investments grow a lot in that time if we have good market returns. Maybe they end up doing something different with their house and they can use some of that equity. Maybe they inherit money. There's a lot of things that change over 15 years. So it's not perfect. We haven't solved the problem because he could die at 76 and leave her with nothing. And it could be a problem too. But having an affordable insurance solution that buys us 15 years of time, I think makes a lot of sense, but I don't know if everybody agrees with that.
Yeah, I would agree. That's the way that I would approach it as well. When there's situations where, if the gap that would be left, if the pension were to go away was $4,000 a month, if it would take $800,000 of life insurance to fully fund that, but even a 10 or 15-year policy is too much premium wise, where, that hurts us on the other end. We just can't afford it. Maybe we can at least cover some of that need, and maybe there's other things we can do with how we claim Social Security or doing something with the investments potentially to help maybe address that gap in another way. So it could be a culmination of factors, but I think that's the right approach.
Okay. I brought you here today to tell me how smart I am. Thank you. I appreciate that. Let's disagree on something. We disagree on. All right. So before we started talking, before we started recording, you were telling me about a client you had that's moving out of state or thinking about it.
Yep.
Tell the listeners about that.
So I have a client right now, came to mind because we were going to be talking a little bit about pensions today and inflation. So wants to retire in 4 years. She's a New York State resident currently. Her home is totally paid off. She's, again, going to work 4 more years. Two of her kids have started families in Ohio. So she wants to be able to spend a lot of time out there when she does ultimately retire. She does now in the meantime, whether it's like once a month trips and what have you. So effectively where the financial question is coming into play, which she asked me, is I want to know what my options are and what I can afford. Whether it's, I think in a perfect world, she would want to have a place in Ohio, but not sell her New York home. So then some questions about, hey, how can we afford that? What's the best way to fund that? The question then came up about, okay, now if she's now an Ohio resident, does her state pension get taxed? That could be definitely the case. So that's a scenario she asked me about. She also was like, what if I sold my New York home and then downsized and bought a smaller place out in Ohio? How would that look? So those are the scenarios that were brought up from a client recently that we're going to start working on and putting together for her.
Interesting. We've had a few of those conversations too. It's always grandma wants to move closer to the grandkids, which is nice to do that.
Yep.
And then I find a lot of people are just attached to their home, which makes sense. I'm sure I'll be attached to my home in 30 years, but I think the American way is to own a home and people take pride in that. But I think of those situations, if the goal is to spend more time with your grandkids out of state, if part of you wants to still have a footprint in New York, does it make sense to sell your house and rent an apartment in 2 different states, find an affordable place to go?
Yep.
And I think financially that can make a lot of sense. I don't know your client's specifics, but I think that can make a lot of sense. You free up cash from the sale of your home, rent a decent place in both places. You get rid of the headaches of like all the lawn care and maintenance and all that stuff. And it probably is affordable, but I find that people generally have a hard time actually going down that road.
Yeah, it's the place you've lived most of your life in a lot of cases. You raise your family there, and think about selling that as emotionally can be a difficult decision. And that's a good argument for less maintenance around the house and lifestyle thing around, especially as people get older and they're just not able to do more and more. Some people really like doing that stuff. They like getting out there and taking care of the house and mowing the lawn. And so that's part of what helps them fill their days in some cases. Yeah. So stuff that I would not have necessarily thought about, but does come up and you're just like, okay, this is just another thing that we have to factor into everything here.
What's interesting about this is, so we have a lot of people that move out of state. They want to leave New York State for tax reasons. So they go to Florida and they spend 6 months and 1 day there so they can be a Florida resident and not pay New York State income tax. You found the one person, or at least the first person I've heard of, that should maybe stay in New York State for 6 months and 1 day and then live in Ohio for the rest of the year.
Yeah.
So that their New York State pension cannot be taxable and
Yeah,
they pay less taxes here. That's unique.
It is an interesting situation where it makes sense actually for this person to be a New York resident.
Yep.
Because then her teacher pension will not be taxed in that case. Whereas if she was an Ohio resident, it would be taxed.
Staying in New York State for tax reasons. I've never heard of that. That's great.
Yeah.
I hope that works out for it. All right. We're getting to the end of our time here. Anything else that you wanted to cover?
That was it. Those were a lot of good conversations there.
That was pretty good. That was rapid fire. We got through a lot of things. We covered inflation. We covered pension decisions. Covered moving out of state for the grandkids. We talked about COLA, which is always exciting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about crypto next time. Nobody wants to hear about crypto.
Yeah, we'll talk about that next time.
Okay, we'll talk about it next time. All right. Nick Savas, thank you for being here. Friend of the show.
Thanks, Alex.
We did it. I like friend of the show. He'll work that in more.
Make it a great day.
Make it a great day. Is that what Dave does? Make it a great day?
So, yeah.
Securities and advisory services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor. Member FINRA and SIPC. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. Individual tax or legal matters should be discussed with your tax or legal professional. Nick Savas, CFP, RICP, not affiliated with or endorsed by Cultivate Financial Planning.